A man and a woman are sitting in a living room, watching a movie. In the spare room nearby, their 4-month-old daughter was sleeping. It was a hot summer's evening, which had everyone a bit irritable. As they watched their movie, the baby's shrill cry tore through the quiet. The man leapt up, ready to check on her. But the moment he stepped into the spare room, a sudden gust rushed past him, almost as if it came from within the spare room. The man saw a shadowy figure move quickly past him. He'd almost dismissed it as a trick of his own shadow as he passed under the dining room light until the woman's startled scream echoed behind him. What was that? The baby's terrified cry echoed throughout the house. Tonight I have a chilling story to share just in time for Halloween. Picture this, an old house silent and shadowed, where every creak and whisper seems to carry secrets from another time. But sometimes it's not just our imaginations that bring these shadows to life. This tale follows a young girl named Maddie, who agreed to house sit for her grandparents. She thought she'd spend a quiet night alone, scrolling on her phone, maybe watching TV until something began to stir in the darkness around her. A soft whisper at the door, shadows moving in corners of her vision, and a presence she couldn't quite shake off. So turn down the lights, maybe even light a candle if you dare, and join me as we step into Maddie's Halloween night encounter with the unknown. Because tonight we're about to uncover the kind of story that leaves a chill lingering long after it's over. The room was dark, and the only light came from the faint red glow of the digital clock by her bed. It read 2:12 a.m. Maddie lay on her back, staring at the ceiling, trying to shake off the creeping sense of unease that had settled over her ever since she woke. It was a noise. Or maybe a feeling. But something wasn't right. She listened carefully, hoping the sound had been a figment of her imagination, a remnant of a half-forgotten dream. But then, faint and unmistakable, she heard it. A whisper. Soft, breathy words impossible to make out, coming from the other side of her bedroom door. Maddie froze, heart pounding as she strained to make sense of the sound. Her cousin, Emma, had come with her for the night, crashing in the spare room down the hall. But there was no way it was her. She'd gone to bed hours ago, long before Maddie had drifted off to sleep. Maddie lay perfectly still, torn between the urge to get up and check, and the overwhelming fear that kept her glued to her bed. The whispers grew, just enough for her to hear the rhythm of words but not enough to understand them. Suddenly they stopped, leaving a heavy silence in the room. Maddie held her breath, staring at the door. Had it been Emma? Or something else? Just as her fear began to overwhelm her, the door swung open. Maddie gasped, barely managing to stifle a scream, as Emma appeared, looking livid. Her face was pale, her eyes sharp with anger. "Why were you whispering outside my room?" she demanded, arms crossed, her expression furious. Maddie stared back, baffled. "I wasn't," she whispered, her voice cracking. Emma looked at her suspiciously, her brows furrowed. "I heard you," she insisted. "Twice. Someone was out there, right by my door, whispering." They sat in uncomfortable silence, neither willing to admit just how unnerving it all was. Finally, Maddie gestured to the other side of the bed. "Just sleep here with me," she whispered. Morning came like a breath of fresh air, the sunlight chasing away the shadows and filling the house with warmth. Maddie and Emma laughed over breakfast, making light of the incident. In the daylight, the whispering felt surreal, like the remnants of a bad dream. Maddie even joked, "Old houses always make weird noises, right?" trying to reassure herself as much as her cousin. But Emma wasn't convinced. Maybe she muttered, but it felt real, Maddie. Like someone was right outside my door, she admitted that. As she first entered the spare room, she thought she'd seen a shadow moving in the corner, but she dismissed it as a trick of her mind. Now, she wasn't so sure. By early afternoon, Emma had left, and Maddie found herself alone in the house. She had been nervous at first, but as the hours passed, her fear faded. She lounged on the couch, scrolling through her phone and flipping channels, waiting for evening to come. Maddie did her best not to look at the dark doorway of the spare room, but she often found her gaze drawn toward it. The spare room was positioned just off the dining room, which was adjacent to the lounge. Due to the open plan layout, Maddie had no choice but to have the spare room in her view the whole time. As the day wore on, a strange sense of fatigue began to creep over her. She hadn't done anything strenuous, yet she felt exhausted. The air in the house seemed thicker somehow, pressing down on her like a heavy blanket. Unable to shake the feeling, Maddie settled onto the couch and drifted off to sleep. When she woke, darkness had fallen. The warm afternoon light was gone, replaced by long shadows that pooled in every corner of the room. Maddie sat up, blinking as she tried to shake off the disorientation that clung to her. Something about the house felt different, colder, quieter, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. Then the phone rang. The sudden noise jolted her, her heartbeat quickening as she crossed the room to answer the call. Her mother's voice crackled on the other end, warm but laced with concern. "Hey honey, how's everything going?" "It's fine," Maddie replied, but the memory of last night lingered. She hesitated, then added, "Actually, something weird happened last night. I thought I heard whispering outside my door." Her mother's voice became serious. "Is Emma still there?" Maddie shook her head, though her mum couldn't see her. "She left a while ago." Her mother's tone shifted. "Listen, honey, maybe it's best if you don't stay there alone tonight. I can come pick you up." Maddie wanted to argue but felt a wave of relief at the offer. "Okay, thanks, Mum." She hung up and sat back down, wrapping herself in the warm quilt her grandfather kept on his armchair. She tried to calm her racing heart, the eerie silence filling the house once more. 5 minutes later, the doorbell rang. Maddie jumped, her nerves completely frayed by this point. She opened the door to find Emma standing on the front step, looking sheepish. "I didn't want to stay another night after what happened," she admitted. And Maddie nodded, understanding. "It's okay," Maddie said. "Mum's coming to get me too." Emma gave her a brief, awkward smile before leaving, disappearing into the night. Maddie closed the door, locking it carefully, but the strange, oppressive silence continued to fill the house. Staring out onto the dark, silent street, Maddie almost laughed to herself. Her grandparents had left earlier to attend a Halloween party at a friend's place, and it was only now that Maddie realized the date, October 31st. As she sat in her grandfather's armchair, Maddie's gaze fell on the open doorway leading into the spare room. An old memory drifted into her mind, one of hiding in a small cupboard with Emma, playing with a flickering flashlight. They had laughed and whispered to each other, sneaking around even though her grandparents had told them not to play in that room. But there had been a sound, hadn't there? Maddie remembered the faintest whisper of voices outside the cupboard door, so faint they had dismissed it as one of their cousins playing a prank. She shivered at the memory. And then there was that eye she remembered. One eye staring at her through the crack in the door. She recalled holding her breath, squeezing Emma's hand, and pressing themselves flat against the back wall as that eye stared, unblinking, waiting. Sitting alone in her grandfather's old armchair, Maddie's mind shifted to a story her mother once told her. It was a story she could never shake, and now it felt like the air in the room was thickening, her heart beating faster as her mother's voice echoed in her mind. A chilling memory she'd shared only once but had stuck with Maddie like a dark shadow. It was the same house, after all, that her mother grew up in. Maddie could still hear her mum's voice, so casual and almost resigned as she'd recounted the experience. "When I was 14, I had a really tough year," her mother had said. "There was just this darkness that seemed to follow me around, and I found myself struggling with depression. I'd moved into your aunt's old room after she moved out, and it was right by the office. I thought I'd finally have some space of my own. But it wasn't long before I learned I wasn't alone in there. Maddie could picture the scene exactly as her mum had described it at night. The silence would stretch, then break with strange noises coming from the computer in the dining room, a chair scraping softly, a keyboard tapping. She'd asked Linda, their boarder, if she'd been using the computer late at night, but Linda's irritated response told her it wasn't her. After that, her mother would lie awake in bed, blanket clutched tight, staring at the foot of her bed where, night after night, a dark figure stood. She told her aunt, who'd advised her to tell it to go away, but it didn't always work. Maddie's mum had tried to sleep, her blanket pulled up over her head, whispering into the darkness, "Go away. Leave me alone." Most nights, though, the figure just stayed. Maddie shivered, tugging her own blanket closer, feeling the chill in the empty room before her. Her mother had described a night so terrifying it seemed to sink into Maddie's bones. I woke up around 3 a.m. Twisted up, my whole body contorted. I could barely move, her mother had said. I don't know how, but I forced myself to fall asleep again, hoping it was just a nightmare. But it wasn't over. The next night, Maddie's mother had given up on trying to tell the shadow to leave. Exhaustion settled over her until something heavy pressed down on her. A weight held her throat tight, one hand around her neck. It felt like it was trying to pull something from me, she'd said, her voice trembling. And finally, the part that had made Maddie's skin crawl, all I could do was try to scream. Somehow I managed to let out a tiny sound, and just like that, it disappeared. I ran to my parents' room in tears. Her mother had stayed on the couch for weeks after that, until her family had a Catholic priest come to bless the house. But even after her mother confessed, she felt like something was still there, lurking in the shadows, waiting. Maddie blinked, the hallway in front of her taking on a new weight, a menacing quiet. The old house creaked, and she could almost feel that same darkness her mum had described, its patience, its silent watchfulness. Maddie's mind was racing. Why had she accepted to house sit for her grandparents? They had never believed the stories about the strange things happening in their own home. Both grandparents had always denied seeing anything. Maybe that was true, or maybe not. As the night crept on, Maddie's eyes kept darting toward the doorway. The darkness of the spare room seemed almost alive, pulsing as if waiting for something or someone. Just then she heard it again, the faint sound of footsteps. They were soft, almost tentative, as though someone was treading carefully, not wanting to be heard. Her breath hitched as she strained to listen, every muscle in her body tense. The footsteps grew louder, moving slowly toward the living room. Strangely, they didn't seem to come from the spare room. They were moving down the hallway from the other end of the house. Maddie's heart pounded as she forced herself to remain still, too terrified to even breathe. The footsteps stopped just outside the doorway into the living room, and in the darkness, she thought she saw a shape, a tall shadow hovering on the edge of her vision. Then, just as suddenly, the shadow was gone. The silence returned, deeper and more oppressive than ever before. Maddie sat frozen, her eyes wide and fixed on the doorway. Only when she heard her mother's car pull up outside did she finally let out a shaky breath. Without a second thought, Maddie jumped up, grabbed her belongings and raced to the front door. She frantically tried to unlock it but found herself fumbling with the lock. Maddie felt the whispers just behind her, the sound pouring over her shoulder and into her ear. After a moment of struggling, Maddie got the door open and rushed out to meet her mum. But as she left, Maddie cast one last glance back at the house. A flicker of movement caught her eye from the living room window. She stared, but the window was empty, the room dark. And yet, as they drove away, Maddie couldn't shake the feeling that something was there, watching her go. For Maddie, I'm sure this was a house-sitting experience she'll never forget. What do you think happened in that house? Could it have been her imagination playing tricks on her? Or was there something more sinister lurking in the shadows? Have you ever experienced anything like this before? It reminded me of the many chilling and interesting stories I've read about shadow people. If you've made it this far into the video, thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. Also, if you would like to hear another one of Maddie's stories, click the link on the top right corner. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss out on our next creepy tale. If you have your own spooky experience to share, we'd love to hear it. Until next time, stay safe this Halloween and be careful if you ever find yourself alone in an old, dark house.